Now, that being said, I want to address something here that I touched on in the chapter that I just quoted from, which is the accusation or concern that forensic science is not real science, meaning that it isn't based on the same degrees of academic inquiry or research that we see in things like biology, physics, chemistry, medicine, engineering, and so forth. What we might call the more classical sciences. To scientific researchers who have more academic sensibilities about them, forensic science often appears to them to be a family of homegrown pseudoscientific techniques and methods that arose not out of academia and not out of the same kinds of research intensive environments that we see in medicine, for example, but rather forensic science was thrown together hastily by cops. So, to these kinds of observers, forensic science is not real science, it's police science, with big, huge air quotes used to qualify the word science. Because, it's not really science. I mean, come on. Looking at scratches on bullets or ridges on fingers or bite marks on skin, give me a break. And people are actually convicted, sentenced, and sometimes even put to death because of this stuff. I mean, is there a such thing as having a PhD in bite marks or a master's degree in firearm identification or latent print identification? Who the heck do you think you are going into a courtroom with this garbage and using it to convict people and deprive them of their life or liberty based on this junk police wannabe science? You should all be ashamed of yourselves. How dare you? And so the criticism goes. There's way too much to unpack here in the limited amount of time that we have in a single episode, but it is important to recognize something here, which is that over the last 30 to 40 years, there were four specific areas of forensic practice that seemed to fuel the attacks on forensic science in the courtroom more than any other. And so they sort of created a legacy of discontent and confusion. And those four areas were human hair comparisons, blood serology, fire pattern interpretation, and bite mark evidence or bite mark comparisons. These were the forensic practices that innocence activists saw as being especially troublesome. The first two, in fact, are inherently problematic, even for the scientists that practice these disciplines, because they don't or didn't lend themselves to conclusive determinations. For example, with blood, back in the day prior to DNA, you could only say what type it was. However, you could, in fact, conclusively eliminate a person as being the contributor of a blood stain. So, a victim with one particular blood type isn't going to leave a stain in the trunk of a perpetrator's car that has a type, a different kind of type. That would be an elimination, or we would rule out that person or that source of that blood. In the same way, you might um, you might be able to say that this person could not have been the originator of let's say, a hair found on a bed sheet at the scene of a criminal sexual assault. Hairs and blood decades ago were great for ruling people out or ruling sources out, but not for identifying people conclusively. There were limits. So this created confusion at times. And if you were testifying in court, if you use the wrong words, you could easily worsen that confusion. And to be candid here, This happens to be a very legitimate criticism of hair comparison examiners back in the day because they used to use the term match to describe hairs that had similar physical or optical properties, even though they couldn't identify the hairs as coming from the same person. It would be kind of like having it'd be kind of like having two red apples that are about the same size, the same weight, the same color, and generally about the same shape and size, and so you say that they match. But in fact, they're different apples, and they are not going to be identical at every possible level of analysis. So how can you say that they match? That's a legitimate question. Now, with regards to the comparison of hairs or serology, there is absolutely nothing we should point out here that would prevent a defense attorney of even modest competence from asking, so what does match mean? And then the scientist would be responsible for explaining the limitations of the work and what that word means, which they usually did anyway to make sure their conclusions weren't misconstrued. They don't want to mislead juries, at least the vast majority don't. But again, words matter, and they should not be manipulated to give an advantage to one party in a trial over another. Even hairs that were described as matching might have had differences about them on some level, including potentially their mitochondrial DNA structure. And so that term is not used anymore, and that's good. And good for justice reform advocates who held forensic laboratories and forensic practitioners in these particular areas of practice accountable for this.